Then there was a knock. A few seconds later, they knocked again. All I could see was a dark figure moving near the door, but from the shape of it, it didn't look like he had any sort of law enforcement gear on, so I was sure this was about to get really bad. I was part of a search and rescue team dispatched to Olympic National Forest in the summer of 1983. The call came in late Tuesday night, just as I was finishing a shift at the station. Terry Fishgold, a local hiker who had been walking the trails for years, hadn't returned from one of his solo trips. His wife had waited until Monday evening before she called, thinking he'd just stayed out longer than expected. When he still wasn't back by Tuesday, she gave us the details and a description of his gear. His last known location was a trailhead near the Quinault River, and his intended destination was a ridge around 8 miles north. It sounded routine. Terry knew the forest, and we had a clear starting point, so I'd have bet my last dollar on us finding him by sundown. But as it happened, that particular search and rescue operation proved anything but routine. Including local law enforcement and a bunch of civilian volunteers, around 30 to 40 of us gathered at the trailhead just before dawn on that Wednesday. We loaded up with the usual radios, first aid kits, maps, rope, and flashlights, and then split the search area into a grid. My team and I took the western edge of the grid near the river while the others fanned out east. The plan was to sweep north, hit the ridge by nightfall, find Fishgold, and bring him home. Then, at exactly 5:47 a.m., we hit the trails. The first few hours dragged on with little to report. We moved slow, scanning for broken branches, scuffed dirt, or anything that might show Terry had passed through. We'd called out his name every so often, but apart from that, the forest was quiet. But then around noon, the voice of one of my team members buzzed through my radio and broke the silence. He'd found something. I adjusted my course and then hiked a half-mile east to meet the rest of my team. When I got there, they were all looking up. High up in some tree about 30 feet off the ground was a backpack. It was torn open. Its straps were flapping, and the contents had spilled out onto the branches and ground below. From its appearance alone, we knew it was Fishgold's, and it was just as his wife had described it, a green keel tie with a red patch stitched on the side. One of my team, a guy named Jim, volunteered to climb up, rigging a rope and harness while we watched from below, and the tree was thin. Its branches were too slender to hold much weight, yet the pack was lodged up there, caught like it had been thrown with an impressive amount of force. When Jim brought it down, we saw the damage up close. The fabric was shredded with long gashes running through it, no bites or scratches from what we could tell. It was more like something sharp had ripped it apart. Inside, Terry's water bottle was cracked, and a soggy sandwich sat, just half-eaten and crushed with the dirt. And there was no blood, though. Not yet from what we could see. That came afterward. 2 hours later, one of my team radioed in. She'd found one of Terry's boots in a small clearing. I hiked over, and there it was, just like the Danners his wife had mentioned him wearing. Brown leather, laces tied, standing upright, like he'd stepped right out of it. No blood, no damage, just the boot sitting there alone. We marked the spot and moved on, figuring the other one would turn up close by. It didn't. About an hour later, one of the other teams called from the eastern edge of the search ring, almost 2 miles away, and when I heard what they had to say, my blood turned to ice. They'd found the second boot, but it wasn't empty. Terry's foot was still inside, cut off just above the ankle. The bone break wasn't clean. The skin was torn, and a few flies were circling it. The blood was still sticky, too, meaning it hadn't been there very long. The other team said that they snapped a few photos for the report, and then they bagged it and moved on. But after that, the forest started to feel heavier to me. We'd seen bad injuries before. Falls, shootings, animal attacks, but this didn't fit. A bear might tear into someone, but it wouldn't leave a foot in a boot, severed clean and dropped miles from the other one. We widened the search after that, breaking the grid into tighter sections. And not long after, we noticed the blood. The first time I spotted some, it was on a tree. It was a small smear, no bigger than a coin, staining the bark at eye level. One of my team found another spot 10 feet away, higher up like it had been flicked there. Then another pointed out more droplets splattered across the cedar's lower branches. We started marking them with flags, and it didn't take long to see the pattern, or rather the lack of one. The blood was everywhere. Tiny specks of it spread across the forest in every direction. I'd taken a few steps and find another dot, and then another, like someone had taken a blood-soaked rag over entire sections of the woods. But late afternoon, we'd covered almost half the grid and found nothing. No body, no clothes, just the pack, the boots, and his blood. A few hours later, the sun was starting to set, and a fog was rolling in. We stuck closer as a group, not really talking much at all. We just kept moving, marking blood spots and searching for our missing hiker. Night came fast, and we set up a base camp near the ridge. The plan was to rest as much as possible and then pick up at dawn, but I couldn't sleep. The forest was too quiet. There really didn't seem to be any wind or animals, just this sort of eerie silence. Then, at around midnight, I heard a branch snapping. It was loud and sharp, maybe 100 yards out. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and swept that beam across the trees, but I didn't see anything move. I stayed put and things stayed quiet till I was relieved. But it was the same unnatural quiet, the kind that you'd never hear in the woods at night, unless something's making everything else stay quiet. I got a few hours of sleep after a teammate took over the watch, but morning didn't bring me any relief. We packed up and pushed north, following that blood trail, and it kept going, smeared on trunks and dotted on branches, with some spots so high that I had to tilt my head all the way back to see them. I found one mark on a pine tree 10 feet up with no limbs below it to climb. The blood looked fresh, like it had been put there while we slept, and I remember that sense of creeping apprehension growing as I marked it on the map. One of my team found a cluster of droplets on a rock arranged in a rough half circle. Another spotted more on a fallen log, a thin line of blood streaking the moss. We stopped trying to make sense of it at that point. We just kept going, hoping to find Terry, or by then what was left of him. And by noon on the second day, we'd reached the outer edge of the search area. But on account of the pieces we'd found, the prospects of finding fish gold alive were getting slimmer by the minute. We tried our best, covered all of the ground we'd set out to, but it was no good. We called off the search on the afternoon of the third day. Terry was obviously dead. No one could lose that much blood and still be walking around. We radioed it in, packed it up, and left the rest to local law enforcement. When we hit the trailhead, I looked back. The trees were just standing still. The fog was starting to roll in again, and officially Terry wasn't anywhere in the grid. But my gut told me that wasn't all the way true. The official report listed this as an animal attack. The bear made sense for the torn pack and the severed foot, but I knew that it wasn't right. No bear could toss a pack 30 feet into a tree onto branches too weak to hold its weight. No bear could spread blood across miles of forest, painting and on bark and rocks like some deliberate mark. I've seen bear kills, the torn flesh, the scattered bones, the mess of guts left behind, but this was different. The report got filed. Terry Fishgold was declared deceased, and his body stayed unrecovered. It was one of 3 failed missions that we had in the 1980s. Most of us moved on after that and took desk jobs or left the field entirely, but I couldn't let it go. The pack in the tree stuck with me, and every so often my mind would wander off, and I'd see the pack hanging there, shredded and out of reach. I'd think about that foot in that boot too, all raggedly severed like it had been torn off and dropped for us to find. I'd remember all that blood, and how the branch snapped, sharp and close, and how I'd been almost certain that something was out there watching us. The team didn't talk about it much after. One of my search and rescue team members, Paul, stayed in touch the longest. And years later, I asked him what he thought actually happened. He simply told me we didn't find him because he wasn't there to find. And I knew what he meant. I just didn't agree that he wasn't there. Whatever took Terry wasn't a bear, but it tore him apart piece by piece and marked the forest with what was left. I think he was still there too. Or I know he was, because of how fresh the blood was on that second day. Another team member, Lisa, quit search and rescue a year after. She moved inland away from the trees and didn't leave a number, and Sarah disappeared too. Not missing, just kinda gone, not forwarding an address. Our guy, Jim, stuck around much longer, and he got kind of quiet and he started to drink more. And I heard that he took a job with the Forest Service. Irony of ironies. Really, though, we never really talked about that mission. I don't blame him. We all carried it differently, but we carried it all nonetheless. I kept the map from that search. The blood marks are still on it. Little X's in red ink stretching across the grid like a web. I don't look at it often, and when I do, it's not unusual for a shiver or two to run down my spine. Terry was gone, but something else was there instead, waiting in the woods. We'd never search again. I'm a 24-year-old female from northern Arizona. This was a couple of years ago. At the time, I was living out of a small camper van, traveling along the west coast. There are a lot of different lifestyles people like to live in these types of vans or RVs. I always tried to keep out of the big cities and stick to small towns for camping in between destinations, but for the most part, I like to camp out in the backcountry. Being in the middle of the woods with nobody else around was where I found myself most comfortable and where I most enjoyed the lifestyle of traveling. I think part of it is that it was always safer to be out by yourself in the forest than it was to be stealth camping in a busy parking lot in the middle of a city. Don't get me wrong, it can still get creepy at night, but I always know I'm better off out there with nobody around. This week, I was slowly traveling between two big cities in Washington. I was taking my time, staying on the back roads and hunkering down at campsites for several days at a time. On this day, I pulled off the road and onto a small dirt trail going deep into the forest. There were a few pull-off spots, but none were taken, and it looked like nobody had been down here in a while. So I kept going, hoping to secure a larger and more scenic spot. At the end, there was a large circle to pull off on. It wasn't scenic, just surrounded by trees, but it was large and secluded and peaceful, and even had a stone circle in the middle for a campfire. I leveled out my van and parked. Since it was the middle of spring, it was raining pretty much every day here in Washington, so there wasn't much for me to do outside. I opened the side door to my van for some fresh air while I cooked a meal on my propane stove. It was around sunset, so I still had several hours before I'd be in bed. Over the next 30 minutes, the sun fell past the horizon and the rain started picking up. I shut the door to keep the water out and instead cracked open one of the small windows near the back of the van. I sat on the bed and watched a show on my laptop, but midway through it, a glare came in from the open window behind me. It was a light reflecting onto the screen of my laptop. Before I was able to react, it went away. It didn't move away though, it turned off as if someone switched the light off. When I turned around and looked out the window, I saw nothing. It was really dark and still pouring down outside. I had no way to know how far the light came from or what it even was. Being on a trail with other pull-off spots, I had to assume it was just another camper. Maybe their headlights somehow found their way through the trees and shined into my window. Then they quickly turned their vehicle off. The only problem with that was the light didn't come from the road I came down. Behind my window was just trees. Maybe there was another trail I didn't know about. There wasn't much investigating I could do anyway. So I turned back around and went back to my laptop. Occasionally, I'd check out the windows or think I'd heard something outside. But with the rain clanking against the metal roof, it wasn't clear if I was actually hearing something or not. Every time I looked, though, I never saw anything to confirm that something was out there. So I didn't worry myself too much. I want to say it was about 10 or 11 when I decided to call it in for the night and try to sleep. I turned off everything in the van, closed all the windows, and drew the shades. It was nearly pitch black inside. I got under the covers and tried to sleep. Usually I didn't have much trouble at all, but tonight I just couldn't manage to fall asleep. Unfortunately, the rain picked up even more after an hour, and thunder started rolling in. It was very loud and made it impossible to even try to sleep. About 2 hours into the night, and through all the harsh rain and thunder, I swear I heard something move outside. It was just loud enough for me to know I really heard something. It sounded like someone or something running and kicking over a branch on the ground somewhere just outside of my van. As soon as I heard it, there were no other sounds. It was so dark I couldn't even see the ground beneath the window. The longer I looked out there, the more uneasy I felt. I just had this feeling like someone else was looking back at me. I put the window cover back down. I sat there and tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but only a minute later, I heard a voice. It was a male voice, kind of in a loud whisper, like they were talking to someone else. I sat in silence, too scared to open the covers and look out the windows again, knowing they'd probably see me if they hadn't already. However, they likely already could assume someone was in the van, which makes it all the more terrifying. There was a good 2 or 3 minutes where I didn't hear anything aside from the rain and thunder before there was suddenly something outside the sliding side door to the van. It sounded like bending plastic, like someone was leaning against the side door. Then there was a knock. A few seconds later, they knocked again. Even though I was sure they knew I was in here already, I was still too scared to speak. Maybe they weren't sure how many people were inside, or if I was a man or a woman, so I felt safer not giving them anything and just staying quiet. A very disturbing and anxious 5 minutes went by as the knocking continued every few seconds without anyone saying anything. They had to be drenched by now and probably couldn't see at all through this weather. But then they finally said something.
"Sheriff's Department, open up!"
What? I didn't believe that for a second. If it were true, why wouldn't they have said that from the beginning? They continued knocking and calling out different lines, all basically stating that they were an officer and I needed to open the door. This seemed like a desperate attempt to get me to open up without violence. I slowly lifted the window cover and looked out. All I could see was a dark figure moving near the door, but from the shape of it, it didn't look like he had any sort of law enforcement gear on, so I was sure this was about to get really bad. I debated in my head what to do for 30 seconds, as it felt like the knocking got more and more impatient before I decided to risk getting into the driver's seat and trying to drive away. As soon as I went up there and turned the car on, I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up to the side of the van. I began pulling out just as a figure appeared in the window next to me. Thank God the van didn't get stuck, and I was able to get out onto the trail. As I drove away, I never saw any other vehicle down the road, which makes the intentions of these unknown people likely really disturbing. I put in a report with the county, who, of course, said no officers were out there that night, but I never got any follow-up. Things could have gotten really bad out there, but I haven't had anything else happen since then. Back in the 80s, I made frequent trips from Minnesota to Connecticut to visit family. The drive, all interstate, is largely boring. Wisconsin and Pennsylvania are pretty, but nothing spectacular. So sometimes I get off the highway and drive secondary roads to meet real people and see the scenery up close and personal. In early June '85, I decided to slow down and take 3 days to make the drive. The third night I spent in the hilly country east of Franklin and near Tionesta, Pennsylvania. Here the Appalachian Mountains are all folded and scrunched up into fascinating concentric ridges and valleys. Interesting stuff to a geologist. Land use closely follows the physical geography. Forested ridges, agricultural valleys. And yeah, it's pretty. On May 31st that year, an outbreak of severe tornadoes raked over western and central Pennsylvania. Long-track F4, F5 tornado damage that bordered on the faintly insane. Somewhat by accident, I arrived into this area a couple of days after the storms. The region looked like a war zone. Houses and reinforced buildings swept clean from their foundations. Road asphalt scoured to dirt. Entire mountainsides looked as though a giant comb and hand mixer had braided together 100-foot-tall trees in the forests. Everywhere, trees were festooned with tightly wrapped metal, signs, house insulation, debris. It was frightening. It was also fascinating enough that I elected to spend the night so I could study the region more the next day. Drove a half-mile into the forest on a dirt track, fixed a hot dinner on the camp stove, then unrolled my pad and sleeping bag and bedded down under the stars. There is a lot of beautiful country to see, and I had to see it. This was my cost-effective solution to low-budget travel. I did it every chance I got. Anyway, it was comfortable and cozy. I read by headlamp for a while, then turned in. A brook chuckled in the forest, an owl in the distance. A few years ago, I was hiking in the woods in northern New Hampshire when I ran across what looked like an abandoned house. I love finding places just like this to explore, so I obviously was very curious about the house's content. There was a pathway to the house made of stones that had been covered with weeds and various other vegetation. The house was surrounded by overgrown grass and tree limbs that had fallen, making it difficult to get to the porch. The front porch was small and made of bricks that had a layer of moss grown all over it. It was obvious that no one had been there in many years. The front door was intact and locked from the inside. I didn't see any broken windows that I could fit through, and the windows on the front of the house were covered in a thick layer or dust and dirt, so I couldn't see inside. I checked if the windows would open, but I suppose the wood had warped and swelled so none of them would open. I gave up on getting inside the house and settled for walking around the backside of the house to explore the grounds around the house instead. When I made my way to the backside of the house, I found a window that was a bit less dirty and was able to peek inside. I couldn't see much. What I did see was an area rug and what looked like a small table beside the window. I decided to check the back door on the off chance that it would open and I could find out what exactly was in this mysterious house. Lo and behold, the back door was locked as well. But when I gave it a slight push, I could feel the frame was loose and weak. It didn't take much force to push the door open, breaking the frame. Yes, I know this is considered breaking and entering, but as I said above, it was obvious no one had been there in many years, and I have a fascination with such places. I couldn't just walk away without knowing what was inside. What I saw once inside completely took my breath away. I was standing in a kitchen, complete with dirty dishes in the sink, a drain board with old cups and glasses turned upside down from being washed, but covered in a very thick layer of dust. There was a small kitchen table with drinking glasses on it, and a newspaper that dated back to June of 1959. The cabinets were stocked with dishes, and there was a tall pantry that contained various jars of preserves and fruits and veggies that had obviously been canned by hand. Everything was covered in dust. I continued to walk through the house and found each room I entered to be completely furnished and covered in dust and dirt. There were spider webs through the entire house, as well as signs of rodent activity. There was dresser drawers with clothes that had been chewed and nested in by what I assumed were mice. In the closet hung clothes that had begun to deteriorate and had holes from insects. Upon further inspection of a child's dress that I found, it seemed that the clothes were handmade. There were 2 bedrooms, one of which was obviously a room for children, with 2 twin beds that were perfectly made up. The bedding was in very poor condition, but seemed to be hand-stitched also. Same thing in the other room, only it contained just 1 larger bed rather than 2. The cabinet in the bathroom had a few toiletries, a straight-edge razor, as well as towels that were neatly folded, but had now become nests for small animals. At this point, I was very creeped out and began feeling as if I was being watched. I decided it was time to leave this strange house that appeared to be stuck in time. As I walked through the short hallway that led back into the living room area, I decided to see what kind of pictures were hanging on the walls. I wiped some of the dust off one of the pictures hanging near the door, way of what appeared to be the parents' bedroom, and discovered it was a photo of a wedding. The photo was very faded and appeared to have some type of mildew growing behind the glass. I decided to take a moment to check out a few more pictures in the frames that hung throughout the home. Most were of scenery or various still life subjects. I found another photo hanging in the living room near the front door. This one was of the entire family. It was in worse condition than the previous photo, but I could clearly make out a man, a woman holding what appeared to be a very small infant, and 2 children sitting on the floor at their feet. I found this very odd, as I hadn't seen any signs of an infant anywhere in the home. I don't know what could have possibly become of this family that lived in the house. Did they leave for work and school and never made it home? Did they decide to take off and leave all their worldly possessions behind? Why? What happened to the infant in the family photo? To this day, I have many questions that I have no clue how to find answers to. I stumbled upon a home that day, not a house. That was a family's home that they lived in, experienced life in, and mysteriously disappeared from. I've never been back and never intend to. Just thinking about that place creeps me out. It was as if this family had no clue they'd never return to their home the day they last walked out the front door. And it was apparent that no one had come to look for them. I don't live near the woods, but my co-worker did. Sean was having a small birthday party and invited me. Since he was a bit of an oddity, the other co-workers insisted I go and check out his pad. I like odd people, so I didn't need a lot of convincing. To get to his place, I was instructed to just head to the Piggly Wiggly about a quarter mile past the turnoff and call me and someone will pick you up. This was before cell phones, so I was to use the payphone there. Apparently the dirt road that led to his place was too rutted and washed out to navigate without being familiar with the route. I asked for instructions anyway, just in case. Sean didn't have a 4-wheel drive or particularly high undercarriage on his car, so I figured I'd give it a shot at making the trip myself. I'm a pretty fearless person, a cave diver, and have experienced solo backpacking, etc., so what was the big deal? I got to the cemetery, I'm not lying, where I turned in and, after a very short distance, quickly realized there was no way I was going to be able to navigate this in the dark. I put the car in reverse, too narrow to actually turn around, and slowly backed my way out and parked at the cemetery. I then got my flashlight, my beer, and my purse, and started back down the path on foot. Sean said it wasn't that far, so I thought this should be fine. Now for those unaccustomed to rural areas, you should know it is dark. No street lights every 500 feet, no passing cars, no light bouncing off clouds from nearby shopping centers or ball stadiums. I don't even remember moonlight on that particular night. It was pitch black. Yes, it was creepy, but I pressed on with my bad self. The darkness seemed to swallow up my pathetic flashlight. I did my best to work my way around the ruts and washouts, and after about 10 minutes in, I heard the most horrible scream. Good God. Almightly, what was that? I stopped, heart racing, and contemplated the situation. I couldn't get a feel for how far away it seemed, or even precisely which direction it had emanated from, although it did seem to have come from the direction I was headed, deeper into the woods. I didn't hear anything else, so, feeling bold, made the decision to just forge ahead, don't be such a wimp, and went a few more feet down the path. The scream came again. I tried to make sense of it. There just wasn't anything to compare it to. It was a cross between a scream and a bark, so like a woman screaming but being stabbed, causing the scream to get cut short. A very primal sound indeed. And then a third scream. Oh hell no, it was too much. I hightailed it out of there and made it back to the car and took off for the Piggly Wiggly, made the phone call, and my ride came shortly without further incident. Later, relaxing at my friend's cool bohemian place, an old converted barn, I asked him about the screams I'd heard. His only insight was that there was a neighbor nearby who had peacocks. Maybe that was it? But no. Sometime later did hear some peacocks, and that was not the sound. Then about a year later, I was sitting in movie theater watching a British murder mystery. The main characters were in the woods burying somebody, and I heard the screams. What the hell is making that sound? I asked my friend. Oh, that's a fox, he laughed. Lol. A fox. How such a cute, furry little critter can make such a terrifying sound I'll never know, but I sure am glad I found out. It wasn't a real woman being murdered that night. That event was truly one of the most frightening times I've ever had.